The UFC is back in Australia for another pay-per-view. They haven't held one there since UFC 193 when Ronda Rousey was dethroned by Holly Holm. They are back in Australia, in a new Australian city, as a matter of fact, for another pay-per-view, but it's a far cry from the bright lights of the Rousey sort of show that they had back in 2015. Welcome, everyone. My name is Luke Thomas. The gentleman on the other side of your screen is Danny Segura, and this is your MMA Fighting UFC 221 preview show. Now, Danny, I mentioned at the start of this program that the UFC is going to have another pay-per-view this weekend in Perth, Australia. They've never been to Perth before. The last time they held a pay-per-view was 193. Now, they've been back a number of times with a few Fight Night shows in between then. I think they were even there as recently as November with Verdum and Tybura for a Fight Night show in Sydney, but they've never been to Perth. That's neither here nor there for just the moment. But their last pay-per-view in 2015 was a gigantic show, Danny, with Ronda Rousey's historic loss. But of course, it wasn't just the loss that made it big. It was a giant pay-per-view to begin with at the Etihad Stadium, if you'll recall.
Yeah.
And now they're back in Perth. And the main event for UFC 221 is not a bad fight, and no one could say it is. But man, you want to talk about a downgrade from the bright lights of UFC 193, right?
Yeah, I also believe 193 had one of the biggest crowds in UFC history, if I'm not mistaken, if not the biggest. But yeah, this is a huge downgrade. But you know, as you said, by no means is this a bad card. I mean, if this was a UFC on Fox, this would be a fantastic card, and if it was a Fight Night, even better. However, we are used to a certain level of stardom. We are used to a certain level of class when it comes to pay-per-views, a certain level of quality, really. And this card does not deliver. And I hate to be Debbie Downer. I feel like I've been like that for the past few preview shows, but you know, this is not a really good pay-per-view, and you can make the case that is one of the worst pay-per-views this company has put together in recent history.
What's interesting to me about it is when you look at the card, I mentioned this on the MMA Beat yesterday, if you look at the card, it's like it's built for Australian TV. We're going to get into some of it. Now, the main event doesn't have an Australian on it because it was originally supposed to be an Australian oceanic representative in Robert Whittaker taking on Luke Rockhold, and that was going to be the unifying moment for the middleweight title. The middleweight title still can't quite get fixed from this detour that Michael Bisping went on after fighting Dan Henderson. And frankly, the Dan Henderson fight was a detour itself. We're still not on the right path, low this many months after all of that. But it was supposed to be an Australian there and then Australians all the way down. And if you look at it, it's like, wow, if you're an Australian, there's a lot to like here for your local guys. If you're a television executive in Australia that airs the Ultimate Fighting Championship, you're probably pretty happy. But I just don't know what they're thinking making this a pay-per-view. Again, it's not that it's necessarily bad. That's not true. But the question is, when we get so many cards for free, when we get so many cards on different platforms, what is it about this card that makes people want to shell out $60 or more? And again, main event's not bad, but I don't know exactly what's on there that's going to get folks to really come up off their pockets.
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I'm still wondering the same thing. What exactly does this card have that would want to make a fan, you know, take out $60 out of their pocket and pay for it? Because, you know, frankly, there's some fighters in the main card here that have only had one UFC fight that, you know, I work in the MMA media and I vaguely know. So, you know, I can't expect the casual to 100% know who they are. So it does lack a little bit of star power. And I mean, I don't know how it's going to do in pay-per-view buys, but, you know, I don't have a feeling it's going to do well.
So, with all that doom and gloom to the side, and by the way, if you hear some bumping and banging, no, it's not my neighbors enjoying the company of each other. I had a fire at my home that some of you might know, and the construction crew is here, and they're going to be here for about a month. So, I apologize in advance if you hear some noise. I'll try and minimize it to the best extent that I can. All right, Danny, let's talk about this card just a little bit now. Let's start with that main event. Luke Rockhold taking on Yoel Romero for the interim middleweight title. This is unbelievable, right? All right, time out for a moment. I know this looks a little bit different because it is different. Danny and I recorded this video about the preview show a while ago. Then life happened, and then later on, Yoel Romero misses weight for his fight with Luke Rockhold. So let's start there, Danny. I want to talk about Luke Rockhold, and I want to talk about Yoel Romero and their fight. But let's get to the biggest news about that. Yoel Romero misses weight on his second attempt, only 187.7. He needed to be 185 because it is a title fight. You get no 1 pound allowance. So even actually, if there had been a 1 pound allowance, he would have missed weight. But here's the point. If Luke Rockhold wins, he can become the interim champ. If Yoel Romero wins, he cannot become the interim champ, but of course he can still win the fight. Your big takeaway from this?
I mean, this is literally worst case scenario after worst case scenario after worst case scenario for the UFC. I mean, let's just start with GSP vacating the belt. Like that's already pretty bad in itself, and then you have to promote the interim champ, two undisputed champ, which that's not ideal. Then the actual champ that just got promoted gets injured. Then you make an interim title fight, and now it's not really an interim title fight. It kind of is. At least for one guy. So I mean, this is just insane, and it's a huge hit for the pay per view because at least you had a solid interim title fight that you can promote as, hey, this whoever wins here is going to get the next shot. If I mean, Yoel Romero wins, he's really just has a win over Luke Rockhold, doesn't really get that interim belt. So I mean, there's still not clarity in the middleweight division. So this is just a big mess for the UFC here.
What if I told you, well, what does it really matter? Because this is really just a number one contender fight for Robert Whittaker anyway. I grant you that you want everyone making weight, and I grant you that it'd be better if there was no controversy about this. Although in some sense, maybe the controversy about this will help raise attention for it. I don't know, but what if I just told you that like in the end, the winner of this is just going to fight Robert Whittaker, who's a real champ anyway?
I mean, possibly, but you still don't get that champion versus champion fight, that unification belt, fight. And what are we used to seeing in pay-per-views? Pay-per-views are usually championship fights in the main event, and this is halfway that. So, I guess, yeah, I guess the winner here, regardless, will get a shot at Robert Whittaker, most likely. But it just makes things a lot more murkier. I mean, if a guy walks out of UFC 221 with an interim title, we know for a fact he's going to be versing Robert Whittaker. If Yoel Romero picks up a win here, like there's still, is he the number one contender? I mean, there's still a lot of up in the air. I suppose they would give him the shot, but he recently fought Robert Whittaker not too long ago. Then you got the Kelvin Gastelums of the world out there, the Chris Weidmans. It doesn't make anything that much clearer. I think it's still murky regardless.
Well, it's definitely not good. As you pointed out, the middleweight division just cannot get clarified here. I mean, again, some clarification will happen no matter what, but like this ongoing calamity of there's just no clear process ever happening. It's always these like ad hoc processes or whatever. Everything's deviation from the normal path. It's really not all that great. Danny, via text to Brett Okamoto of ESPN, Dana White sort of defended Yoel Romero. Are you surprised by that? He was saying, well, the guy took the camp on short notice. It will go forward as we had told before, that Luke Rockhold, if he wins, gets the belt. If Yoel Romero wins, he does not get the belt. Are you surprised that Dana White didn't burn him at the stake?
No, not surprised at all. Because I mean, this guy just literally saved your pay-per-view event, and Luke Rockhold as well. Because imagine if that fight would have fallen through. What, Curtis Blaydes versus Mark Hunt is going to headline a pay-per-view? Probably not. So, Yoel Romero took this fight on short notice. All the way to Australia. Perth. He has got to go pretty far and take a bunch of flights. It's not an easy fight to get to, and he still got pretty close. So. It's hard to blame Yoel Romero in this one. He's also a very big dude. He's a guy in his 40s, so it makes it a little bit harder to cut the weight. So it's really hard to put blame on Yoel Romero.
And that said, Luke Rockhold took to Twitter and said, should have been doing the salsa in the sauna, some bull S as usual. And it got 6,000 retweets. Any chance this adds, or I should say through the controversy, any chance that this adds pay-per-view buys in the end, that people are it's raising awareness for it?
I don't think so. I think these headlines that are popping up are mostly seen by people who are already going to watch the pay-per-view and are into MMA. I don't really see a casual that was dabbling on whether or not buying the pay-per-view, and then all of a sudden there's weight issues and there's a tweet. They're going to go, oh, you know what? I'm going to buy this pay-per-view. It's a great card. Because it's really not, I mean, it's a good card, but not worth $60, at least, to many people. And I think a lot of people would agree with me. So I don't think it does much. I think it adds interest as far as the people who are already watching, because I'm curious to see how Yoel Romero looks after a bad weight cut. Now there's some bad blood. You saw that stare down. They were getting in each other's faces. Luke Rockhold was probably telling him something about the weight, and they seemed kind of upset with each other. So it definitely makes it a little bit more interesting, but I don't think it goes too far to reach into new audiences.
Well, let's do this. We have the old program where we did all this extra analysis. So I want to get back to that. Danny, thank you so much for joining me. I appreciate you guys tuning in for this extra little special edition that we get to plug into the video. Let's do this. You now understand and are up to date what's going on with Yoel Romero and Luke Rockhold. The fight's going forward, but only one guy can be champ, or interim champ anyway, after it's over. Let's get back to our regularly scheduled programming, right? We had finally found a moment where we were going to be able to unify the middleweight titles, and now we're not anywhere closer. How damaging do you think this is to the notion of, not middleweight significance exactly, but don't you wish we could finally get some finality? How damaging is it that we can't cross that finish line?
Of course, yeah. When Robert Whittaker pulled out of this fight, obviously, he had a series of insane injuries and illnesses. It was like, what? Are you serious? Like, this is the last thing they needed, especially after the whole GSP thing, GSP vacating, which did not look good for the middleweight division. And now this is another hiccup. Well, this is not good news, but at least you're getting the two best guys fighting. I know Kelvin Gastelum was out there, vouching for this fight, and a few other guys. But I think if you were to ask most people, I think most people would agree that these two are the next in line right after Robert Whittaker. So at least they got that right. But yeah, it is completely damaging to the middleweight division because, again, I've mentioned this before. I even mentioned it on the MMA Beat. Interim champions have never seen as real champions, again, interim, and they don't carry the same sort of prestige as a real champion. So, and these two guys are championship level fighters. These two guys are two of the best fighters in the world. So, to have them fight for an interim belt, it's kind of, it doesn't look good for both, but, at least they got that right, that the fact that, the two top guys in the division are facing each other for the belt.
Belt to no belt, it's an excellent scrap. Let's dig into it just a little bit. Yoel Romero's in a really interesting position, losing to Robert Whittaker in a close fight, although I thought Whittaker in the end was the rightful winner. Now he gets a second shot at it, not against Whittaker, but against that interim, or for that, I should say, that interim title against Luke Rockhold. What's interesting to me is each guy has something in the tank and in their toolkit that the other person is uniquely susceptible to. So, for example, we know Luke Rockhold has incredible cardio, and if this fight goes longer and longer and longer, that's definitely going to be a big problem for Yoel Romero. On the other hand, Yoel Romero can just explode out of nowhere like a rocket ship. And for somebody like Luke Rockhold, who I don't think has a bad chin, but not the best one I've ever seen, and can be susceptible to guys who can explode into range on him, that seems kind of bad. On top of that, Danny, we know that Yoel Romero is a great wrestler. Well, Luke Rockhold is a great kicker, but how much of that is going to be nullified by the wrestling? It's actually like a really interesting fight. So let me ask you this. Less so who you think is going to win or lose. We'll get to that in just a moment. But more of, what is the fight going to look like early? And if it goes late, what will it look like then?
Yeah, I think there's no question that Yoel Romero is going to try to close the gap, either to look for a takedown, which, I was very critical of his wrestling in the beginning of his UFC career. He has great accolades, a great, history in the sport of wrestling. But in MMA, he never, at least in the beginning stages, he never really was able to transition that well. And, we saw him have some issues taking down some people and even just keeping the fight standing when he has such a great wrestling background. He's like, why are you not taking the fight to the ground? Well, now he's actually getting his wrestling skills into wrestling MMA, and they've been looking good. His wrestling's been looking good, so he's going to either try to close the distance to look for a takedown or land a big shot or press him against the cage. Luke Rockhold, he has a very long frame on the stare down. We clearly saw that there was a big size advantage as far as height and reach. So he'll probably want to stick Yoel Romero at the end of his punches and kicks. Luke Rockhold has a bit of a bad tendency of when he strikes, he doesn't really bring his jab back straight immediately, or his kicks. He kind of just leaves him out there for an extra second. A few fighters have made him pay for it, obviously. Michael Bisping, we saw, who did he recently fight? David Branch recently also caught him a few times, grabbing leg kicks and stuff like that. And I mean, Yoel Romero is super explosive, so it is a bad habit to have when facing someone like Yoel Romero. So there's going to be a lot of play and range in this fight. Luke Rockhold trying to keep his distance, Yoel Romero trying to close it. I feel like that's really what we're going to be seeing.
I think it's an interesting matchup on the ground. We saw Romero was able to get takedowns on Whittaker and even hold him down for a little bit, but he can't really advance position on the ground. He doesn't put the hooks in. By contrast, Luke Rockhold, number one, I'm sure has a very good guard, although we don't see a lot of it. But on top, man, he is really, really technical. He's one of the more technical big guys in the UFC that exist. I'm not sure he's the heir to Frank Mir in terms of big man jiu-jitsu, but he's very, very nimble on top. And I wonder if Yoel Romero gets tired. Boy, I mean, if you thought Robert Whittaker was putting it on him there, I would say Luke Rockhold's probably a little bit better, at least in that department. So here's what I'll say to you. If Yoel Romero hasn't put him away by the 4th round, is it hopeless for him?
I don't think so. Yoel Romero has this weird thing that it's sort of kind of hard to describe. I think it's a little bit more than resilience. He just finds a way to win. I don't know what exactly it is. I can't really put my finger on it, but this is the guy that can be hurt and he's still dangerous, and not just because he's powerful, just something about his spirit and the way he carries his fights that, he's always looking for a way to win. I mean, just look at the Tim Kennedy fight. I mean, how many fighters can come back from getting rocked like that and, come back and win? Obviously there was a bit of controversy there, but you just go down his fights and he always seems to find a way to win. Even the Chris Weidman fight, that was a very close bout. I think I had it 1-1, and he just always figures some way out to win. And he has so many athletic abilities that he has many avenues to sort of go through and find that victory. So I think even a tired Yoel Romero is a game Yoel Romero, is a dangerous Yoel Romero, a Romero that you can't underestimate and you can't take lightly. So, sure, there's definitely going to play more advantages for Luke Rockhold as the fight goes on, the deeper it goes. But I think Yoel Romero is still game and dangerous at any round.
I'll say this. If you could ask, will the winner be viewed as the best middleweight on earth? And you would probably say no, that guy's going to be Robert Whittaker. However, I will say that if Luke Rockhold comes back and, let's say, smokes Yoel Romero, because Yoel Romero has never been smoked, well, at least not in the UFC, right? Just never happened. So imagine if Luke Rockhold comes in there and just, blows the doors off of him. And I see that as unlikely, but MMA is crazy. Then do you think there might be some controversy? I mean, the two are going to fight eventually. If Luke Rockhold wins, he's going to fight Robert Whittaker. So at some point, I don't know if it's a discussion necessarily worth pouring over too much, but is there a chance if Rockhold wins that he could be once again viewed as the ascendant middleweight on earth?
I mean, I feel like some people already view him as one of the best fighters in the world, and certainly the best middleweight. I mean, it depends how much people put stock in that Bisping loss, because really that's really been his only hiccup in recent times. But, a lot of people could say he took him lightly or lucky punch, whatever the case may be. But definitely I think he's already up there. I think there's already a question that this guy might be the best middleweight in the world. And frankly, I think he's one of the best pound for pound fighters in the world. So I think that question is already there. If he beats Yoel Romero, whatever way he beats him, whether it's decision or finishes him, there's no doubt that's going to be a huge question. And who knows, maybe when he enters the fight with Robert Whittaker, if he does get past Yoel Romero, he'll be a favorite, depending on how this fight goes.
So that takes us now to the co-main event. Curtis Blaydes taking on Kiwi, but sort of hometown hero, Mark Hunt. Okay, a couple things about this fight. I mentioned this before. I thought Eric Anders really needed to break through against Lyoto Machida. One of the reasons why we're having this DC Stipe fight is because there's just not enough guys in this heavyweight and light heavyweight division breaking through. And Curtis Blaydes didn't have quite, or I should say currently doesn't have quite the hype that Anders had going into that one in terms of that, All-American football background, University of Alabama. But nevertheless, turnover is good. Mark Hunt, I think people have a deep admiration for him. He's obviously been in a lot of had a lot of issues with the UFC. Although, interestingly, you noticed, have you been watching Embedded for this series? I
actually haven't.
You haven't. So Mark Hunt's been featured quite prominently. They've been following him the entire time, and he appears to be in great spirits. He's got good friends with him. He appears to be, for Mark Hunt, in excellent shape. Not going to be ready at the Arnold's to go pose down, but you get the idea. Look, they're trying to put him on big cards. They resolved whatever issue they had with him after that Player's Voice article. Nevertheless, keep in mind, he is coming off a win over Derek Lewis in June, but before that lost to Overeem, and before that was the Brock Lesnar fight, and before that was the Bigfoot and Frank Mir fight. In other words, this would be the Derek Lewis win is pretty nice because it's an up-and-coming contender. Again, another guy trying to push through, and the older guys are keeping a cap on him. But Curtis Blaydes has a real opportunity here. He hasn't really made much of a name for himself. He does have some decent wins. The Adam Milstead one got overturned, but it was a good one. But he's got a real opportunity here to make a name for himself. How big could a win be on a pay-per-view where we're acknowledging it's not the biggest pay-per-view ever, but a win over a legend like that could do things for you?
I mean, as soon as he gets Mark Hunt in his resume, a victory over him, he immediately becomes a player in the heavyweight division. Now we start thinking, okay, who do we match him up with? And we start thinking about top 5 guys, maybe top 8. So he immediately becomes a player. He immediately becomes a contender. Obviously, not a top one, but he's gonna have to start. After this fight, if victorious, he'll start getting those big names again. He's not gonna go back to the Olynyks or the Cody East or other fighters like that. He's gonna get the big names. So yeah, this is a breakthrough performance, a breakthrough fight. I mean, so it's 100% important for his career. And if he doesn't win, it sets him back. This is it. I think this defines whether he becomes a player in the heavyweight division at this time or not.
So the question now is, how does he do it, right? And my thought is, I went back and I watched some of his fights in preparation for today's video. He's got good wrestling. He's got real good wrestling. Now, Ngannou was able to time that uppercut as he closed distance. And, Mark Hunt has a fantastic rear hand uppercut. So I worry about that because Curtis Blaydes has gotten a lot better about his footwork, a lot better about his movement, but not so much in setting up the attacks, not so much in really sticking to the jab or getting fakes to get a reaction and then countering that response. But he's got really good wrestling. He ragdolled Adam Milstead. He was able to get takedowns against Francis, and I know Francis doesn't have necessarily the best takedown. He's a huge, strong guy.
Yeah.
Mark Hunt, we saw it. Now, I'm not saying Curtis Blaydes is Stipe Miocic, but he did have a ton of success once he was able to close the distance in the wrestling department. What kind of success will Curtis Blaydes have against Mark Hunt in that sense?
You know what? I actually think, this is one of those type of fights where they're, again, pitting up a veteran with a big name against an up-and-coming guy. And I mean, ideally, you kind of want the younger guy to become a name off the veteran here, keeping in mind that, Mark Hunt's already, fairly old. And Curtis Blaydes, I think he's only like 26. So he's pretty young for a heavyweight. He's a baby for a heavyweight. But, I don't think this is much of an Andrei Arlovsky, Francis Ngannou type fight. I think this might be more like a BJ Penn. Like a Yair Rodriguez, Frankie Edgar. Maybe not to that extent, but I do think, he's a bit overmatched here. I was just watching his last fight, writing my predictions column for MMA Fighting. And, his wrestling and his striking, especially his striking against Olynyk, look a little sloppy, look like needed still a lot of work. Again, this was a guy that not so long ago he was doing like cardio kickboxing at a UFC gym while fighting in the UFC. Now he's got a solid camp. We've seen him improve, but I think this might be a bit too soon for him. Mark Hunt is ridiculous. He's super skilled. Hard guy to take down. Just because he's so heavy. He's got such a heavy base. It's hard to, change levels and get that low on him. Again, some fighters have been able to do it. We saw Stipe Miocic do it, Brock Lesnar do it, obviously. But those guys are big. Those guys are big heavyweights. And, Curtis Blaydes, obviously, is a big dude just fighting at heavyweight. But, he doesn't have the same build as those guys. He doesn't seem as muscular. And we know wrestling and strength go hand in hand. So I think he's going to have a tough time taking down Mark Hunt here.
The other big question here is Mark Hunt, as we alluded to, and everybody knows, it's no secret, has had his issues with the Ultimate Fighting Championship. Now, he's currently ranked 5th. Let's say he beats Curtis Blaydes. He'll have beaten a guy at 9. So you're thinking to yourself, well, what does that really do for you? I mean, it's a win. That's good, right? But what does it really do for you? But above him is Cain Velasquez, who we don't know what's going on. Fabricio Verdum is still in the mix. And, of course, they have, I wouldn't say unfinished business, but they have history anyway. Then you have Alistair Overeem, who just lost. And then you have Francis, who, of course, just lost. So here's the question for you. Let's say he beats Curtis Blaydes, and I'll up the ante. Let's say he beats Curtis Blaydes from pillar to post. Does he get a title shot of the winner for DC Stipe?
I mean, who knows? With the heavyweight division at this point, the top 10. I mean, I feel like really the only thing that matters is the top 5, and even then, there's a lot of fighters coming off losses. This is a tough one. I don't think he'll get a title shot. I think Fabricio Verdum has a victory over Mark Hunt. 2, I believe he's 2-0 right now, as far as since his loss to Overeem, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, but if Mark wins, he'll have 2 consecutive wins. In other words,
right. Well, no, I believe Fabricio Verdum has 2 consecutive wins, if I'm not mistaken, and he's fighting at the main event of London. I think if he picks up a win there, I think he'll get the next crack. Also, there's Cain Velasquez. We know he's going to return this year. At least that's what it seems like. Because Cain Velasquez has always been like, yeah, I'm going to return, but he never gave us a timeline. Now, when he says a year, now we can sort of have something to look forward to. And I think, he's still a huge name. I think if he really wanted to, the UFC could give him a title shot immediately. My guess is if Fabricio Verdum picks up a win, they'll do Cain Velasquez, Fabricio Verdum, and then the winner gets a title shot, whether it's Well, maybe against Daniel Cormier or Stipe Miocic, depending on who wins that fight. But I think Marhunt's still pretty far away from a title shot. Maybe give it this win plus another.
So that brings us to the rest of the card. We're not going to go into this into great detail. I just don't think that necessarily merits it. Now, these fighters might have a bright future. I wouldn't say otherwise, but these are not hugely consequential bouts of significance. Let's go through the line here. They've got a series of Australians or Kiwis here that they're trying to put up against people who are not that. So you've got, in his second fight, I think he also fought on that Verdum versus Tybura card, Tai Tuivasa taking on Cyril Asker. Tai Tuivasa, training partner of Mark Hunt. Again, not one of these guys who's going to win a bodybuilding contest, but has a tremendous skill set. Looks pretty athletic for his size, as a matter of fact. And has
very quick guy.
Here's what I want to see. Young guys pushing through. I'm not saying Cyril Asker's an old guy, but let's see if we can get another contender, and especially be good for this region. They clearly want to go back here and do more pay-per-views here. Tai Tuivasa, high upside for you?
I was looking some of his fights. I actually didn't remember watching his UFC debut. He's only had one fight in the UFC, if I'm not mistaken. But I was super impressed. He almost seems like a Mark Hunt 2.0. I mean, his speed is there. He seems to be a lot more active as far as what he throws. He mixes things up well. He hits hard, man. And he just seems, we didn't see much of his grappling, but we saw him get out a few positions, and it seems he knows enough to keep the fight standing where he's really good. This is a good fight for him. He's fighting a wrestler. He's fighting a guy that can't take the fight to the ground, but he's also fighting a guy that doesn't have that many physical attributes to bring in the heavyweight division. Although he's a very skilled guy, he's not super fast. He's not super strong either. So I think that's going to hurt him a bit. Tai Tuivasa, he's a big dude. He's going to be hard to take down. And, I see him, picking his shots and landing well. And I think he's going to pick up a finish here.
So that takes us to the next fight. Below that, Jake Matthews taking on Li Jiangliang. Li Jiangliang has improved dramatically. And Jake Matthews, I remember I spoke to him a couple of years ago, and he was like, I really he was on this tremendous win streak. And he was saying, I really want to get a fight in Vegas. So they gave him one. And he got smoked by Kevin Lee. Now, he's still a very good fighter. I understand that. But they put him back on the Australia cards where they only use him when they're back in that area. And here they are again. They're back in, not back in Perth, but back in Australia in Perth for the first time. And he's taking on a tough customer. So this is interesting to me. Like, Jake Matthews has his stock is it's still high, but it's come back to earth a little bit. And Jiangliang's has risen a lot. And that guy is tough and takes a lot of risks. He's a hard one to deal with. This, to me, is a very, very competitive fight. I wouldn't have said that 2 years ago.
Yeah, this is actually one of my favorite matchups outside of the main event. This is a fantastic fight, and I'm pretty high on both fighters, actually. I've been pretty high on Jake Matthews. I know he's had mixed results in the UFC, but he's only 23 years old, and he's already had 8 UFC bouts, which is insane. He recently was fighting a long time at lightweight, moved to welterweight, and still looked pretty big. So, I think that move is always good. A lot healthier for him. This is a guy that there's two things. This is how I see Jake Matthews. It's either he's that guy that, because whenever I see Jake Matthews fight, he shows little moments of brilliance here and there. And you see him fight, and it sort of feels like he has another gear to him. He's just not able to reach it. I don't know if that's because, he's still fairly inexperienced, just being 23 years old, and he's still putting things together, and we'll see, that extra gear sort of develop in the future, or he's an actual guy that just fails to, kick it up an extra notch. I guess we'll find out, but I have a feeling this is a prospect. I have a feeling this is a guy that's going to get a lot better as time goes on. But the Leech, he's fighting somebody that's super tough, and I don't care who you are in that welterweight division. The Leech is a complicated fighter. I mean, he'll complicate you the fight. He's a guy that is going to get in your face, put pressure on you, tough, swings hard, has takedowns. He makes the fight very physical. He'll make a tough fight for anybody at welterweight. And I don't know if you remember, the last time he fought, he looked like a star. It was, I believe, in Singapore, was it the fight? But anyways, he looked great. Put on a great performance, looks solid. This is another guy that, again, is coming into his own. Seems a little bit rougher as far as skill goes. It relies a lot on athletic abilities. But again, this is one of my favorite matchups on the card. I got the Leech. I think he'll be able to overpower Jake Matthews. He's just one of those guys that he might face higher level competition, but he's able to override that just with pressure and just making the fight physical. So I got the Leech, but I think this will be a very competitive fight, and it can go either way, honestly.
Lastly on the main card, Tyson Pedro, who had great wins over Paul Craig and I believe Khalil Roundtree, and sort of fell short against Ilir Latifi. Still very high on this guy in terms of a potential upside. We'll see. Still a lot of proving that has to happen. Another one we need at light heavyweight to push through. Taking on Beck Safarov, has one UFC fight and got lit up by Jean Vellante. Seems like Safarov is incredibly tough, but I don't really necessarily think he's got a whole lot for Tyson Pedro unless something is dramatically wrong with him.
Yeah, this is a showcase fight for Tyson Pedro. Tyson Pedro's only 26. His opponent's 31 years old, and in his UFC debut against Gian Vellante, he did not look great. I mean, he looked like a tough guy. He looked like a guy who has a lot of heart. But his wrestling didn't look impressive. His striking didn't look impressive as well. While Tyson Pedro, man, that guy can wrestle. That guy can hit hard. Tyson Pedro is a really bright prospect in the light heavyweight division, and I think a lot of people sleep on. This is a guy that can become a player within this year. I feel like he can easily bust in the top 10, top 15. But yeah, I think this is a showcase fight for him. And the UFC did an amazing job at we also often criticize the UFC about, them not putting the local stars on the cards, but they stacked this card up with a bunch of Australians and people from Oceania. So, again, this is a showcase fight for him to kick off the main card. And, I don't expect anything but a finish from Tyson Pedro here.
Let's wrap things up here. Any fight on the prelim card that's caught your attention? Easy one for me. Jussier Formiga taking on Ben Nguyen. Nguyen had a bit of a tough loss against Louis Smolka, but has rebounded quite nicely. He has sort of moved to this area of the world, I believe. I think he moved to Thailand to train and then now has settled in Australia and has he's from North Dakota, I believe, but calls this area home now. Has done really well on some of the other times the UFC has come back there. This is a tough fight for him. Yeah, it's the kind of fight that would say if you lose to Louis Smolka, then over time you get better, and then you beat Jussier Formiga. It's just a real demonstration of growth. That's the one I've got my eye on. What do you have your eye on?
Yeah, that's a great fight. I feel like that fight could even deserve to be on the pay-per-view main card. I mean, we could be easily staring at a future title challenger here with that fight. But there's a couple of fights that catch my interest. For some reason, I have a certain fascination with the storyline of big name fighters, skilled fighters that are perhaps going through a rough patch and are in that process of trying to get back in the win column and they just keep losing, sort of like the BJ Penn stories. I know they're very sad, but for some reason I have interest in them. And Ross Pearson versus Misuto Hirota is a fight that sort of interests me. Ross Pearson, I believe he's in a 4-fight losing streak. He's dropping down to oh no, this is a lightweight fight if I'm not mistaken. But he's a guy that's trying to find his rhythm back. He's a guy who's trying to get back in the win column, and I'm curious to see what sort of measures he's doing to reinvent himself and get back in the win column, because so far he hasn't looked great in his past performances. I believe his last fight was a knockout loss. So I'm really curious to see how he turns up in this fight. Again, he's getting a favorable matchup here in a grappler and a guy where he can exploit the sort of striking department and sort of get points there. So that's one I have my eye on. The other one would be Teruto Ishihara versus Teco Quiñones. That's a pretty good fight, in the bantamweight division. Ishihara is dropping down a weight class, so I'm curious to see how he looks. And he's got an interesting style of fighting, using a lot of kicks and sort of standing sideways, while Quiñones has that Mexican boxing style where he's just in your face, bouncing on his feet, throwing out his hands a lot. So I think that's going to be a fun bout as well. So those are the two fights I got my eye on in the prelims.
Did you see John Anik's Instagram post about traveling there to call the show? He had 29 hours before he was able to even get to Australia. Then he had a delay, and then he had another 6-hour flight. I think he was in the air well over 30 hours. I mean, I would just quit the job at that point.
I think he said something like, I left my house like 29 hours ago or something like that.
And he still had the equivalent of flying from like my area, DC, to like LA or something.
Yeah. Or crazy. From Miami to Colombia.
Yeah.
6 hours, yeah.
Not even. You can fly from Miami to Colombia in like 4, 5.
Yeah, 4 hours.
Are you kidding? It's crazy.
Yeah.
Anyway, so it'll be John Anik and it will be Jimmy Smith on the call. Very much looking forward to that. Nice little twist here for a UFC pay-per-view to get that. So if nothing else, maybe that will interest some fans. Danny, I appreciate it. You can follow Danny at Danny Segura TV on Twitter. You can follow me at L Thomas News. Danny and I will be back after the fights for a post-fight show. So until then, thank you guys so much for watching. We'll talk to you on Saturday night.